My name is Eszter Kismödi. I am the Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, or SRHM, and I am warmly welcoming all of you on behalf of our partner institutions co-organizing this webinar, the Just Futures Collaborative, the Center for Reproductive Rights, the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, and the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation on surrogacy as a matter of sexual and reproductive justice. I would like to call the attention to some operational issues. One is that you are most welcome to put questions in the Q&A, as you may see on the bottom, a little bit on the right bottom of the screen. And you can also find captions on many different languages. Again, on the very bottom line on the screen, you go to Show Captions. Then you have to enable translation. And under that, please use the My Caption language. It will show you various languages and it will translate you to various languages. We do not take responsibility for the correctness of the translation, but it may help participants to navigate through various languages. So I really warmly welcome our panelist today, Sarojini Nadipali, who is joining us from. My name is Eszter Kismödi. I am the Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, or SRHM, and I am warmly welcoming all of you on behalf of our partner institutions co-organizing this webinar, the Just Futures Collaborative, the Center for Reproductive Rights, the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, and the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation on surrogacy as a matter of sexual and reproductive justice. I would like to call the attention to some operational issues. One is that you are most welcome to put questions in the Q&A, as you may see on the bottom, a little bit on the right bottom of the screen. And you can also find captions on many different languages. Again, on the very bottom line on the screen, you go to Show Captions. Then you have to enable translation. And under that, please use the My Caption language. It will show you various languages and it will translate you to various languages. We do not take responsibility for the correctness of the translation, but it may help participants to navigate through various languages. So I really warmly welcome our panelist today, Sarojini Nadipali, who is joining us from. My name is Eszter Kismödi. I am the Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, or SRHM, and I am warmly welcoming all of you on behalf of our partner institutions co-organizing this webinar, the Just Futures Collaborative, the Center for Reproductive Rights, the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, and the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation on surrogacy as a matter of sexual and reproductive justice. So I really warmly welcome our panelist today, Sarojini Nadipali, who is joining us from India today, Nerima Vere, who is sitting in Kenya, Veronica Esparza from Mexico, Eng Chadi, who is joining us from Cambodia, and Suba Vijay Sirivardena, who is sitting in New York today. Let me first give you a little bit of the framing of our webinar. Our space today is designed to understand that surrogacy is not a marginal issue. It sits at the crossroads of sexuality, reproduction, gender, technology, and science, labor rights, migration, and social and economic justice, and the comprehensive framework of human rights. It brings together complex questions about autonomy, consent, inequality, and care. This space today for our conversation is designed to look beyond polarizing debates and instead raise important and legitimate questions. How can we understand surrogacy through the lens of rights, justice, and bodily autonomy? How do we ensure the well-being and rights of surrogates and protect them from exploitation? What role do economic injustice and inequality play in shaping surrogacy arrangements, and what are the alternative frameworks? How do we balance the needs and rights of different actors involved in surrogacy, the surrogate, intended parents, and children born from these processes? And what happens when surrogacy is criminalized? Who is most harmed and whose bodies become the site of control? Our panelists will bring different perspectives of these issues, but also very different country experiences from all over different parts of the world, working with different movements around different sectors. Women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, migration, sex workers' rights, LGBTQI movements, and feminist movements across the world. These questions that we are raising are complex ethical rights and political questions. But they are also questions about justice, human rights, about who gets to make choices about sexuality, reproductions, and under what conditions. Our webinar and our speakers and our conversation is also very cognizant about the today global and political space in which surrogacy is positioned. We recognize that we are living in a moment where bodily autonomy itself is under attack. Across regions and various social, economical, and political contexts, we see restrictions on abortion and contraception, attacks on gender and sexuality education, criminalization of sexual orientation, prohibition of the recognition of gender diversity, and rising hostility towards migrants, all of which seeking to curtail our freedoms related to sexuality, gender, and reproduction. Within this wider backlash, surrogacy has become a symbolic battleground like many other issues. It is often portrayed as inherently exploitative or as violence against women, as, for example, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls reports suggest to the General Assembly. Such framings are appealing to anti-rights movements because they let them claim the moral high ground while eroding rights, controlling women's and people's bodies, excluding LGBTI plus Q families, and reinforcing patriarchal and nationalist norms around sexuality and reproduction. When governments or international bodies call to eradicate surrogacy in all its forms, they are not protecting women, in our view. They are expanding state to control over bodies, families, sexuality, and reproduction, and the freedom of expression of all of those. Criminalization or prohibition does not eliminate exploitation, as evidence shows. It simply drives practices underground, increases stigma and vulnerability, and deepens inequality and results in bad health outcomes. Both conservative and at times progressive governments have sought to regulate or prohibit it, often in the name of protection. But as we know, prohibitions rarely protect. They push people in secrecy, increase vulnerability, and deepen inequality. Conflating surrogacy only with the framework of violence against women or trafficking, in the same way conflating sex work with exploitation or abortion with murder, it's weaponizing the language of violence and protection to erode rights, not to defend them. Through this lens, the attack on surrogacy is not only about surrogacy. It's about enforcing narrow norms of gender, sexuality, and family, and reasserting control over sexuality, reproduction, and bodily autonomy. Our panel is going deep today. So, where does that leave us in relation to surrogacy? We explore how it brings us back to the framework of sexual and reproductive justice, an approach that insists that we cannot talk about reproductive rights and sexual and reproductive rights without talking about economic inequality, labor rights, race, migration, sexuality, gender, and climate justice. A rights-based perspective that we are presenting today asks different questions from only talking about violence, exploitation, and trafficking. Rather than asking whether surrogacy should exist, we are asking under what condition it can occur in ways that respect autonomy, dignity, and equality. We know that surrogacy can exist within exploitative and violence-related conditions, just as many forms of gendered labor can, but exploitation stems from inequality and lack of protection, not from surrogacy itself. So in this panel, we are asking what is a rights-based, evidence-based, and gender and justice-based approach to surrogacy that is requiring us to address the structural conditions in which surrogacy occurs, how a framework can protect against coercion, not by criminalizing surrogacy, but ensuring decent work, informed consent, and fair conditions. What is needed for regulatory frameworks that ensure consent, fairness, and safety? And what do we need to explain approaches, regulatory framework, interventions that affirming that bodily autonomy means the right to make reproductive decisions, including the choice to be or not to be a surrogate? We recognize in this panel, and we are coming right away to that without bodily autonomy, there is no gender justice, and without addressing inequality, there can be no justice in surrogacy. So within this framework, I'm turning now to Sarojini, who is the co-founder of Sama Research Group of Women and Health from India. Very warm welcome to you, Sarojini. I would like to ask you, based on decades of work, working across the feminist women's rights and movement, and also working with those who are working on surrogacy, trafficking, violence, and separating the two. How do we separate trafficking and exploitation narratives from realities of rights-based surrogacy? What have the lived experiences of surrogates taught us about autonomy, reproductive labor, economic justice, and what are the fine lines between them? I recognize that the answer could be 2 hours, but really thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. Over to you, Sarojini.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And Thanks to SRHM, CRR, and other co-organizers for giving me this opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to learn from my other co-panelists and also from the discussions which will follow later. I want to begin, by situating surrogacy, especially commercial or compensated surrogacy, within the uneasy moral and legal space it occupies in our public imagination. So surrogacy has become one of those sites where law, morality, and ethical ambiguity and women's bodies meet in a tangle of anxieties and contradictions. That's how I would like to begin with. In India, for example, where I am located, and the Surrogacy Regulation Act and the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act, both enacted in 2021, came into effect in 2022. So these acts prohibit commercial surrogacy and permit only altruistic surrogacy available exclusively to married Indian heterosexual couples. So this legal framework, that excludes several persons from the eligibility to avail surrogacy, such as single women, queer and trans people, and foreign nationals. So the law earlier used only married women, divorcee, and now uses the phrase willing women can be a surrogate. So this moral hierarchy, between altruism and compensation is deeply gendered. It assumes that a woman's body, when offered in the name of, I put it in quotes, altruism, love, or kinship, is selfless. But when the same act is done for money, it suddenly becomes, in quotes again, exploitative. So in a patriarchal society like ours, in many countries as well, we know that so-called altruistic surrogacy can itself become another site of coercion. So women in the family may not have the power to refuse a family's request to become a surrogate. Their silence or acceptance is often, read as consent, even when it comes from duty, emotional pressure, or fear of disapproval. So we have seen in our work, that the profile of most surrogates, with whom we worked for many, many years, who enter into commercial surrogacy before the ban, it was prohibited in 2022, showed that there are women from low income backgrounds with limited education and employment options, often burdened with the debt or family responsibilities. So they are the ones most affected by shrinking formal employment, the collapse of agricultural livelihoods, and the feminization of precarious work in the informal economy. So in that context, surrogacy becomes one among a range of reproductive and care-based livelihoods available to poor women, similar to domestic work, nursing, or childcare, but with the possibility of earning a lump sum that could pay for their children's education or clear the debts and so on. So to enter surrogacy, therefore, is not necessarily an act of helplessness alone. It's a choice made within the constrained conditions. So the problem lies not in women's choice to do surrogacy, but in the conditions under which they have to do it. Inadequate healthcare, lack of informed consent, exploitative intermediaries, and absence of legal recognition as workers. So, but banning surrogacy does not remove these conditions. It merely drives them underground. We have seen this vividly in the recent case in Hyderabad, a city in India, where the police uncovered a large-scale illegal surrogacy and baby selling racket in this July, a couple of months ago. So the Enforcement Directorate found that a well-known IVF center was supplying babies, not even biologically related to commissioning couples. So poor women were exploited, medical records falsified, and babies commodified under the cover of prohibition. So this is not an isolated event. It mirrors what happened when organ transplants were banned. Black markets thrived, brokers profited, and poor people were pushed into even riskier transactions. So when the law criminalizes, it multiplies the exploitation. What in the opening remarks also try to point out. So meanwhile, the global fertility industry has simply shifted its geography. So many Indian fertility clinics now operate in countries like Georgia, Kenya, and Kazakhstan, Georgia in particular, where I try to, study a little bit, has become a preferred destination because commercial surrogacy is legal there. Indian couples travel abroad to have children, while the women who once earned from surrogacy here lose their source of income. So the ban hasn't stopped the practice. It has just made it transactional, transnational, and more unequal. So what this tells us is that morality-based prohibitions do not protect women. They protect privilege. They enable the wealthy to find legal alternatives elsewhere, while the poor are left with fewer choices and greater vulnerability. So, from the feminist standpoint, we must hold two truths simultaneously. First, that women have agency and that their ability to decide what to do with their bodies, their bodily autonomy must be respected. Second, that exploitation is real to some extent and must be addressed. We must move beyond the liberal binaries of victim versus agent and confront the structural factors that shape women's reproductive labor. So, to address both exploitation and agency, we need to shift the debate from morality to rights, from prohibition to protection, with all the entitlements and rights, of course. Surrogacy, it cannot be seen in isolation from broader struggles for economic justice, bodily autonomy, and gender equality. So, criminalization of commercial surrogacy not only violates women's right to work and self-determination, but also it entrenches patriarchal, control over reproduction. So further, feminists, many of us, and human rights groups have long warned against conflating surrogacy with sex work and trafficking, an equation that erases the distinctions between consent, coercion, and labor, and invisibilizes the exploitation in other feminized informal sectors such as domestic work or women working in the brick kilns in India. So thus surrogacy must be located within a reproductive justice and labor rights framework, recognizing reproductive work as legitimate work, deserving of fair compensation, healthcare, universal healthcare, I can say, maternity benefits, social security, transparent contracts, insurance, childcare, and nutrition, and so on. So it should provide grievance redressal for surrogates as workers, not as victims. So, in other words, the feminist question is not whether women should be allowed to become surrogates, but whether they can do so with dignity, respect, and autonomy without being criminalized or rendered invisible. That's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarojini. You are raising all the questions that we would like to explore within this conversation. And I would like to turn then to Eng Chandi, who is the Executive Director of Gender and Development for Cambodia. And if you could drive us deeper on the issue of criminalization. You are coming from a country when that ban, where the ban on surrogacy has shown the real costs of criminalization, and it's well documented, including arrest, stigma, and fear. From your work on gender justice, what have been the consequences for women and families and all people involved, and importantly, what alternative or community responses has emerged in this practice? What can we learn about protecting rights without resorting to punishment? Over to you, Chandi.
Thank you. As your opening and what Ginny just mentioned earlier is still an out for me. I'm processing all of those information, and there are so many things that relate to the situation of surrogacy in Cambodia. But I'm sorry, I'm in the event at the British Embassy right now. I hope it is not too loud that everyone cannot hear me. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for letting me have this opportunity to share about the surrogacy situation in Cambodia. So before diving deep into those questions that Esther just asked me, I just would like to reframe the core message again that Sarojini also mentioned earlier. The punitive regulations of women's bodies, whether through surrogacy bans or anti-prostitution crackdowns, does not protect women or society. Instead, it violates women's rights, push vulnerable group into harm's way and reinforce stigma and inequality. So I think we need better solution rooted in human rights, bodily autonomy, and social justice for all. So the first question that Esther asked, like, what are the harmful impacts of criminalization surrogacy in Cambodia? Just to let you know that before 2016, around like 4 years before that, commercial surrogacy was freely active in Cambodia when it was banned from India, from Thailand and Taiwan, and then it just like go to Cambodia during the time. But then because those under market and black market of surrogacy in Cambodia become like wider, cannot be controlled. Then in 2016, the government of Cambodia drafted a law and banned all commercial surrogacy. But in the same time, meaning that there is no law on surrogacy in Cambodia, but all the surrogate mother, women, were charged under anti-human trafficking law. So it's kind of like outlawing surrogacy and targeting women. So the Cambodia issued a sudden ban on commercial surrogacy, and with no specific law in place, surrogacy was treated as human trafficking, making surrogate mother into criminal overnight. So right now, over 60 women acting as surrogates have been arrested and subjected to criminal proceedings since the bans, rather than being seen as individuals exercising autonomy or victims of exploitation. These women have been prosecuted as traffickers. And as I mentioned, those 60 women are not all Cambodian women. They are also like migrant workers who migrated to Cambodia, like the Philippines, Vietnamese who working in Cambodia and was asked to be the surrogate mother as well. And the other harmful one is extreme penalty and disturbing conditions. So the punishment are draconian, surrogate mother that face up to 20 years in prison under trafficking provision. Many were jailed while pregnant. Some even gave birth behind bar. Imagine that they were like 7 months pregnant, and then they were put in jail, and they deliver baby on that bed in the detention center. This is so inhumane. I would like to share you the picture, but I think just your imagination is enough to say how inhumane it is. In the landmark trial in 2020, 32 Cambodian women who had carried baby for Chinese clients were found guilty of human trafficking. They received suspended jail term only on the condition that they raise their children well or be sent back to prison.
Shani, would you like to share the photo?
Later, I will
okay,
do it.
Okay.
Yes. So, and the other thing is the human impact is heartbreaking. Imagine that a woman who becomes surrogate to lift her family out of poverty, she chose to be the surrogate mother because there is a promise that saying you can earn around $10,000 US. So it's over 6 times the average annual income in Cambodia, where roughly 1/3 of people live in the poverty line. But then they were arrested mid-pregnancy and kept under guard, and after birth told that to stay out of prison, they must raise the children that they even have no plan to keep. So Cambodian surrogate like happening like this a lot. You have to choose between whether you are staying in prison or you have to raise the children until they become 18 years old. So you were poor, and now the layer of your poverty is there. And there is no real protection. Authority claim that crackdown was to protect to women and children from exploitation, but as Sarojini mentioned, it's not. In practice, it has re-victimized vulnerable women. Right group note that most surrogates were driven by poverty and lack of option at the sharp end of very economic hardships. But it's also about how they use their body as well. So, and that should be treated as people in need, not criminals. The continued crackdown, criminalization has not stopped surrogacy. It's only driven it underground and internationalized it. Even in 2023, 2024, demand remains high and clandestine network persists. Cambodia has become one part of the global surrogacy market when neighboring countries like Thailand, India, and Nepal tightened the surrogacy and business shifted here. on the wireless intended parent and LGBTQ plus angle, right? An often unspoken aspect is that the impact on intended parents, including infertile couples and LGBTQI family abroad who can't speak up. So this is the reality. So globally, surrogacy bans are sometimes involved with anti-LGBT sentiment. For example, Italy recently even criminalized its citizens arranging surrogacy abroad. More critics say target same-sex couple. The surrogacy criminalization also connect to who is allowed to form a family. I would stop for the harm here and then move to the next question that is asking about Cambodia experience, the lesson, and what are the viable alternatives than this. So for us, we think that the punitive laws are not inevitable, but they can be challenged. Thanks to the advocacy we have joined so far in Cambodia from the civil society, we have brought this issue to the CEDAW committee back in 2018. And then it was the first time that the CEDAW committee issued the concluding observation for the Cambodian governments, making sure that they should not criminalize against surrogate mother, but also in the same time solving the root cause of poverty rather than criminalize against women. And the other alternative here that we can see is we should address the cause, not just the symptoms. So a viable alternative to criminalization is a tackle why this practice can be problematic without assuming that the women themselves are the problem. In surrogacy, the real issue are exploitation and lack of regulation. So introduce ethical regulations that protect surrogate mother health, ensure informed consent, provide fair compensation, and prevent coercion or child trafficking without jailing the women. As in the CEDAW, one of the CEDAW things, principle on state duty mentioned about the corrective approach rather than the protectionist approach that always put women at risk and also in the unequal way. The other thing is about community leadership and support. So this is something that we have done so far in Cambodia, making sure that the community who were affected by the surrogate actions and also those exploitation have space to talk about the draft law. But unfortunately, after COVID-19, the draft law on surrogacy is still there, hanging around and not being prioritized. And right now, if the surrogacy activity is happening, people are still charged under anti-human trafficking law. And the other alternative that we can see is a non-punitive alternative exists. Let's imagine what a non-punitive regulatory approach might look like in Cambodia. So for surrogacy, rather than an outright ban, we should have a system where surrogacy agreements are reviewed by a court or committee to ensure that no one is being forced, ensure that the surrogate is an adult who gives full consent, cap compensation to avoid baby buying, and guarantee citizenship percentage for the baby with the commissioning parent. So the surrogacy isn't left holding the baby unfairly. Crucially, do not criminalize the surrogate or asking like only married women can be the surrogate mother or only if their husband allow them to be the surrogate. And we should focus on empowerment and autonomy. Underlying all this, we need to reinforce a fundamental idea, the bodily autonomy. I would end my sharing because the time is ending now. I think instead of asking how do we stop surrogacy or even sex work because of the body of women, we should ask how do we uphold right and safety of the people involved. Instead of criminalizing women's choice, we criminalize violence against them. Instead of treating poverty with prison, we should fight poverty with opportunity. I would end here and I will share the picture later when we finish all the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate. And I think your example is really showing and very comprehensive documentation of the experiences that how criminalization and banning of surrogacy, including applying the Swedish model that has been most recently suggested, doesn't end exploitation. It really deepens it in many ways. Now we are moving to Veronica Esparza from Hire in Mexico, whose organization has led a groundbreaking litigation on surrogacy. And thank you so much, Veronica, for being here and moving us towards regulations. So what the regulations suggest, as you explained in your several publications, Mexico is a federal system creating overlapping and sometimes conflicting laws. Could you tell us how HIRE has navigated this complexity and how the recent Supreme Court rulings have reframed surrogacy as a human rights issue rather than a moral one? And what can others learn from Mexico about building regulatory systems that protect autonomy and equality? Over to you, Veronica. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Esther. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share today reflections based on HIRE's experience. I'm also very glad to be part of this urgent and necessary conversation. Today we'll speak about surrogacy in Mexico, using it as a case study to highlight regulatory issues in federal systems, as you say, and the importance of a rights-based approach. The insights I will share are based on the work of HIRE, a reproductive justice organization in Mexico with over 30 years of experience. Surrogacy, as almost all the world, presents in Mexico significant challenges. But avoiding them does not solve the problem. Regulating with a human rights approach does not mean eliminating all issues, but managing, minimizing, or ensuring that those who choose to participate do so under conditions of freedom, protection, and justice. In contexts like Mexico's, where the legal framework is fragmented and often non-existent, this practice continues to occur within legal uncertainty and lack of protection. Therefore, rather than adopting absolute positions such as total prohibition or absence of regulation, it is necessary to create a space for clear, ethical, and effective rules that respond to reality, protect everyone involved, and also guarantee dignified conditions to exercise reproductive rights freely and safely. But to fully understand why such regulation is urgently needed and the specific challenges faced, let me begin with a brief overview of assisted reproduction in Mexico. In Mexico, fertility clinics have existed since the late 1980s. Even though fertility clinics have grown, there is still no national law that says who can use these technologies or how they should be done. And how does this work in a federal system? Well, in Mexico, health is a shared matter, but the Constitution states that the general and technical aspects of assisted reproduction must be regulated by the Federal Congress through the General Health Law. The Federation is now responsible of setting rules on access, technical standards, and clinic oversight. Meanwhile, states may only legislate on the civil or familial consequences for the individuals involved in assisted reproduction cases, also surrogacy. The lack of a federal framework has led in Mexico to a fragmented legal landscape. Until now, only 2 states, Tabasco and Sinaloa, explicitly regulate surrogacy. Other 2 states prohibit it, but in the most of the states, remain silent. And this is creating legal uncertainty. Tabasco law dates back to 1997, when it allowed for the registration of children born via surrogacy, but with very weak protections, which led to abuse. Foreign interest increased in 2012 after India restricted access to foreigners and same-sex couples, and Tabasco, to a lesser extent, became a national and international destination, exposing major flaws in its legal framework. In 2016, this regulation in Tabasco reformed, and its law be more comprehensive, but problems persisted. Vague language, jurisdictional conflicts, and continue this legal uncertainty. HIRE published in 2018 a report, Surrogacy in Mexico, Results of a Pure Regulation, where documented serious human rights violations in Tabasco, including lack of contracts, abuse by clinics and intermediaries, denial of identity documents to children, and even some cases of criminalization of gestating women. In 2016, this reform limited participation only to Mexican nationals and also referred only to the contracting mother and father, effectively excluding single people and same-sex couples. As a result, women who had legally signed contracts before the reform were intimidated and in some cases faced legal action. In response of this reform in 2016, Mexico's Supreme Court issued key rulings affirming that surrogacy must be regulated to avoid the harm created by legal vacuums. The court has highlighted also the risk of prohibition and the need to protect gestating women and children through oversight, consent, and legal clarity. It also affirmed that women's autonomy includes the right to decide whether or not to receive compensation, and the laws must protect the rights of all parties involved. And in Mexico also, a central debate in surrogacy is whether it should be altruistic or compensated. While some believe only altruistic surrogacy is acceptable from a moral point of view, HIRE holds that compensation respects women's autonomy and also that banning may increase risk by pushing the practice underground, where payments still happen, but with legal safeguards. It also makes invisible the labor of gestating for others, and also reinforces gender stereotypes that expect women to act only out of altruism without recognition of their contribution. In Mexico, these legal gray areas allow agencies and intermediaries to claim it's not illegal to do it in Mexico. But that doesn't mean it's safe or is well regulated. As seen in countries like India or Thailand, or even in Mexico, laws can shift very subtly, even mid-pregnancy, putting everyone at risk. Despite this limited legislation, HIRE has tracked court rulings on surrogacy in most of the country, 25 out of 32 states. This is showing that the practice is expanding and the family often have to go to court to defend their rights. In Mexico, these judicial decisions have played a crucial role in affirming the rights of children born through surrogacy, recognizing the right first to be registered by the intended parents, and establishing procreational will as a key factor in legal parentage. Courts have also emphasized the best interest of the child, the right to assisted reproduction, the rights of same-sex couples, and also women's right to privacy and autonomy. In 2025, the Supreme Court in Mexico also ruled on a new surrogacy case in Jalisco, a state that still has not a specific law on this topic. And the case concerned the inability to register a child born through a surrogacy agreement. In its decision, the court not only resolved this individual situation, but also highlighted the general need of rules on surrogacy across the country. From a human rights perspective, the court said in this case that a clear regulation is urgently needed. It recognized that surrogacy is a real and a growing practice in Mexico, linked to technologies and legal gaps to put people in vulnerable situations. The court pointed out several risks in surrogacy without regulation, especially for women who carry the pregnancies. Such risks include the lack of legal advice, unfair power dynamics, the threats to their autonomy, health, and dignity. And for response to the risk, the court suggests some basic protections, such as independent legal, medical, and psychosocial advice, free and informed consent, fair economic compensation, and also respect for the woman's rights to make decisions about her own body. The court said that surrogacy should not be banned, but should have clear rules to prevent abuse and make sure it is done in a fair and respectful way. Decisions like this not only solve individual cases, but also set examples that can guide lawmakers, judges, and legal experts. Such decisions show the urgent need to move beyond silence and prohibition and to adopt clear rules that protect the rights of everyone involved. So I want to leave here, and thank you very much for the space.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I don't know, maybe many of the listeners in the webinar, we would love to hear so much more about it, but thank you very much for this deep dive into how the upholding constitutional principles can push for evidence-based regulation even within fragmented legal settings. Thank you so much for driving us into it. And I don't know if you may have a chance, possibly Veronica, to share the Supreme Court decision or any publication that may be great interest, or any of the speakers, your publication, you are most welcome to share it in the Q&A. And going to the African context, Narima, I'm turning to you. Narima Vere is the legal director at the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, and Narima, you are in Kenya. We are coming to the African context where surrogacy is largely unregulated and socially contested. Narima, what does this legal vacuum mean for surrogates and intended parents, and indeed for all participants in the surrogacy arrangements? How, very interestingly, when we talked before the webinar, you pointed out how do the anti-rights narrative influence policy debates across the region now, and how could regional instruments help to advance a rights-based approach in your region? Over to you, Neriman. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you so much, colleagues who've gone before me. You've given some really good insights. So I will focus on Kenya as a case study, but we'll try to answer some of the questions that have been raised by Esther. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very good.
Okay, we'll focus on Kenya as a case study, appreciating that it might not be replicable across the continent, but it does have some good insights on what some of the challenges have been, and then also what the overarching narratives that have risen from this. So a significant problem that has arisen in the last 2 decades within the context of Kenya is what non-regulation of surrogacy has meant for families, for children born out of surrogacy, and for the women who are involved in surrogacy agreements. So surrogacy is largely regulated through the law of contract. And many of the legal challenges have arisen at the point of registering children born out of surrogacy agreements. Many of the most prominent cases around this was at the point of registration of a child, that the hospital or people who were notifying the births and the deaths were opting to register the birth mother as the mother in the birth certificate as opposed to the surrogate mother or the commissioning parent. And this has led to some contestations with families being forced to adopt children born out of surrogacy in order to gain access to them. One of the earliest cases resulted in children being removed from the care of either the surrogate mother, the birth mother, or the commissioning parents, and put in a home because the hospital did not know what to do. They didn't know who to register. The birth mother didn't want to be registered because that was not the agreement for her. Did not want to be registered as the mother of the children and opted not to be. And since they could not register the commissioning parents, they put those children in a home and claimed that they were in need of care and protection, resulting in the parents having to seek an urgent injunction to gain access to the children, as well as then start proceedings for adoption. And this has been the trail of many cases. So this is one case, but there have been around 10 that have gone to the High Court and the Constitutional Division since then, most of them as adoption matters, because commissioning parents have been forced to adopt children born out of surrogacy agreements. Without the adoption process, they then would not be able to access those children or have parental rights over those children. So that's been the context of this. In a number of these cases that are framed as strategic litigation cases, one of the key questions I was asked is, what are courts supposed to do in this legal vacuum? And two of these cases indicated that the state has to take a decision. The state has to legislate on the issue of surrogacy. The court is not the place in which surrogacy can be regulated, but the courts all noted that surrogacy is a fact. It is happening within the context of this country, and it cannot continue to happen in a vacuum, in a legal vacuum. So then this has been the direction, and there have been several attempts since then to regulate surrogacy through bills. So there's been a surrogacy bill, assisted reproductive technology bill, and a reproductive healthcare bill at national level. We, similar to Mexico, have two levels of government in Kenya, and the county governments are also responsible for health, but we have not seen any legislation coming out of the counties regarding surrogacy, but we've seen bills at national level seeking to regulate surrogacy. All of these are bills at this stage have not been passed, and a lot of them have either gone through one parliament into an election without being passed and been reintroduced or not reintroduced at all. But at the core of seeking to regulate surrogacy, three themes have come up. And this is also quite similar with the litigation seeking to protect surrogacy agreements. The theme that kept coming up was best interest of the child. So there was very little mention of the surrogate woman who was involved in this. It was really very much focused on the commissioning parents and the children born out of surrogacy agreements, which is why the logical intervention for the court has always been adoption. Get into an adoption process, adopt the child, and you will be the parent of the child. But the status of the surrogate woman was rarely litigated or rarely considered or rarely discussed. So then the frameworks that I've then focused on is best interest of the child and the need to ensure that commissioning parents have access to some form of reproductive solution. And as such, the bills that have come before Parliament have focused on altruistic surrogacy and not commercial surrogacy, prohibiting commercial surrogacy. This is not, of course, legislation, but just noting the thinking around surrogacy so far. It's been focused on altruistic and not commercial surrogacy on the one hand, and then on the second hand, it's really been limited to married couples. That's how it's been framed in legislation so far. Though none of this has passed yet, it is also really important to note that another angle that has been of interest is surrogacy outside of modern surrogacy. So surrogacy in traditional settings, which happens often in women-to-men marriages in some of the communities in Kenya. And this type of surrogacy arrangements occur where a woman isn't able to bear children and will enter into a marriage with another woman to bear children on her behalf. The other woman, while having children with her partner, her husband, so to speak, is not married to her husband. So there's another question on the protection of women in such women-to-men marriages, particularly at the point that of succession. It really does become a question as to whether or not the woman who has spent her life as a surrogate for this couple has any access to property at the demise of this husband or at the demise of this other woman. And these are questions that, while these arrangements continue to happen in communities, there isn't a legal answer to how then these women are treated. And that has consistently been the tension. The need to understand in any bodily autonomy and reproductive justice framework, how do we then protect women who are who act as surrogates, particularly appreciating that many of the narratives coming out of this is that it ought to be altruistic. People should just be doing it out of the goodness of their heart. And it just goes to developing a framework for surrogacy that has to be rooted either in appreciating that reproductive labor is labor and needs protection for that reason, but appreciating that within the context of patriarchy, reproductive labor is something that men are used to accessing freely. So to have a framework that allows women to negotiate their reproductive labor is not a framework that men are usually willing to enter into. And by men, I don't necessarily always mean just men, but people who are agents within patriarchy are not usually willing to have those discourse. And that's where you see the anti-rights narratives coming out around women seeking to negotiate reproductive labor being seen as either immoral or immoral or something that should not be protected. The other aspect of this is to consider that what does this look like if you don't have an anti-capitalist framework? So that means there is a dictation on the types of things women are able to commodify. So it's okay if you commodify your brain and you go to school, but not if you commodify your body, because that's something that people should have access to freely. It's okay if you commodify your brain, but not if you commodify your reproductive organs, because that's something that people should have access to freely. And these are the narratives that are going on when you discuss surrogacy regulation. At present, due to the lack of regulation, commissioning parents do have a lot of difficulty when it comes to accessing the children born out of surrogacy. But that's only one part of the narrative, and a significant part of the narrative that is missing, because again, the frameworks that have been really focused on is best interest of the child and those rights of the commissioning parents as parents is the rights of the surrogate women. More recently, we have cases where commissioning parents are refusing to honor surrogacy agreements or surrogacy contracts after they've already been at the completion, and whether or not surrogate women have a legal framework that they can rely on. While the courts have said that these agreements are enforceable, there is significant cost that comes to going to court and having to enforce a contract using a judicial process. And this is something that a lot of women do not have access to. And this is to say, while courts have also stated that the agreements are enforceable, they still require commissioning parents to go through an adoption process. So what part of this is actually truly enforceable? So these are some of the really significant questions we are still navigating, and we have to navigate. And what we would say is that regional frameworks do have and can support, particularly utilizing the Maputo Protocol. We can support what, in terms of the reproductive health provisions of the Maputo Protocol, the right to reproductive health, and what that could look like for surrogate women who are not able to access bodily autonomy and negotiate on equal terms what it means to be a surrogate parent. And this can help us advance the narrative. While the Maputo Protocol speaks of reproductive health and rights under Article 14, it speaks about the right to reproductive health, which includes the right to control your own fertility, the right to choose if and when to have children, the number and spacing of those children. And while there's no explicit mention of surrogacy, the right to reproductive health can easily link to an understanding of your ability to control your fertility as well as utilize your fertility, or if so needed, commodify your fertility. But these are discussions that are very difficult to have in patriarchal context, whereby the commodification of anything that women do is usually through the lens of patriarchy and what they're allowed to do. So I'd like to close by saying there are still very significant legal gaps and challenges around this. Often the framing has been the best interest of the child and those of the commissioning parent, and there is a very significant need to really speak more about surrogate women and their experiences so that we can figure out what regulation would look like informed by that.
Thank you so very much, Narima. It's really important to raise all of these questions, and I think it's very, very helpful to deep dive into the legal consideration. As much as we could go on and talk about the child rights and legal considerations, perspectives as well, and very often surrogacy is demonized, the institution of surrogacy in relation to child rights, child health, when very often those evidences are anecdotal, not peer-reviewed, unclear. They don't show conclusions, and actually very often the opposite, the well-being, demonstrating the well-being of children born through surrogacy arrangements are showing very positive outcomes. And in terms of rights, for example, the child rights to know their origins or their medical history is very, very similar, the same as donor-conceived children and adopted children facing similar situations. It's up to their legal parents to share information and the nature, and obviously, as the children's capacity evolve, they should be able to access the appropriate level of information. And now there are legal developments that are requiring anonymity is being reformed, like laws that require anonymity are being reformed, and children born from surrogacy should have the same standing to access this information as the other children, especially once they reach maturity. So I also wanted to bring the issue of legal reform, clear regulations around child rights as it comes to surrogacy as well. That is bringing me to Suba, and drawing from your cross-movement work on many specific issues, as for example sex work, but surrogacy as well, as it happened at the recent dialogue in New York with many fascinating discussion and conclusion points. So can you just tell us a little bit, why do we need a broad intersectional approach to bodily autonomy in general and surrogacy specifically right now? What does real solidarity across feminist, queer, SRHR, violence against women, trafficking, rights around trafficking, labor movements, economic and social justice movements look like? Over to you, Suba.
Yes, thanks, Esther, for the question. And thank you so much to my colleagues who went before me, I think, who have just provided really specific and concrete examples of what kind of regulation can work, what kind of prohibitions don't work. And I think the really diverse country contexts that you all have so richly kind of presented to us have been very helpful in fleshing out this kind of picture of the legal landscape. I think my job today a little bit is also to contextualize the attacks on surrogacy that we are seeing. We're seeing increasing restrictions, criminalization. We're also seeing increasingly the sort of use of incendiary rhetoric in the multilateral space, in the international human rights space, to cast doubt on the work that many people have been doing to establish a kind of rights-based framework for looking at surrogacy. And it's really important, I think, one of the things that we really understood when working with and talking to different folks from different movement orientations on this issue is that it's really important to place the attacks on surrogacy within the broader context of anti-gender, anti-democracy attacks on bodily autonomy, mobility and migration, pregnancy, abortion, trans rights, healthcare, same-sex unions and families, education, including, as you mentioned, Esther, right at the start, the attacks on comprehensive sexuality education in so many places. And the real resistance to the inclusion of gender itself as a framework in both national and international legal and policy frameworks, and as well as in educational curricula. Attacks on surrogacy are also part of a continuum of attacks on poverty and on our efforts to attain economic justice, and feed into the stigmatization of those who are, by no action of their own, placed in the lowest rungs of our current extractive economic order. These are all connected to the same project of, establishing supremacist, fascist, patriarchal, as many of you said, heteronormative worldviews and also world systems, which delegitimize the participation of many of us as full agents, citizens in our communities, in our societies, and limit us in having a hand in deciding our own futures. The motivation behind the focus on surrogacy for anti-gender, anti-democracy actors is easy to understand. The issue gives them a great opening through which to restrict bodily autonomy, to attack the rights of sexual and gender diverse persons, to cast doubt on women's ability to make informed decisions about their own lives. And also, it reinvigorates the debate about the status of a fetus, which is enormously helpful for these forces in other agendas that they are pursuing. For example, the so-called fetal personhood agenda, which we know is a sort of a more recent iteration of the right-wing agenda against reproductive and bodily autonomy. It aims to create legal doctrine which gives rights to embryos and criminalizes a vast range of interventions as they relate to embryos. Attacking surrogacy also gives anti-gender actors an opportunity to promote narratives which degrade some groups. For example, same-sex couples or women or persons who cannot or do not want to undertake gestational reproduction, those who accept compensation for undertaking gestational surrogacy, while uplifting others to the top of the hierarchy. So, for example, heterosexual couples who can or want to produce their own children. Incendiary rhetoric, like I said, is used by these actors to create moral panic, usually by weaponizing narratives of coercion, force, exploitation. This in a context where the reality is that most powerful state and non-state actors are increasingly opposed to concepts of fairness, equality, human rights, and justice, and themselves frequently deploy tactics of coercion and exploitation against us. This when we are all being forced to live in the fallout of colonialism, imperialism, and highly extractive capitalism, where resources and labor have been and continue to be extracted and exploited from so many across the world for the comfort of the few. The weaponization of violence narratives and the conflation, in particular the conflation of surrogacy with trafficking, for example, unfortunately is continuing to gain traction in the multilateral space. As anti-gender actors have captured human rights instruments, state bodies, and other institutions, and work in concert with regional as well as local homegrown fundamentalist, sexist, racist, xenophobic movements. This kind of formulation, for example, in particular, the continuous conflation with trafficking, helps anti-gender, anti-democracy movements in many ways. Not only does it restrict the rights of women and children, especially of those of diverse backgrounds and orientations who make non-normative choices about reproduction for any number of reasons, it also offers states tacit approval for their numerous harmful, severely carceral border policies, which are increasingly hostile to migrant persons, including asylum seekers and refugees, with powerful governments today using threats of citizenship revocation as a way to stifle dissent, which we've seen in many countries, including right here in the United States, but also in other countries in Europe. Our opponents must not be allowed to use surrogacy in a way which expands prison systems, creates hierarchies of good and bad women, good and bad citizens, etc., while restricting and limiting our rights and access to healthcare. We also heard from Chandi, for example, how harsh anti-trafficking laws can justify inhumane treatment of surrogates themselves who have been criminalized. The women that, they are all claiming to want to protect and save, without addressing root causes which underlie the context in which surrogacy often occurs, such as increasing economic inequality, climate change, driving infertility, as well as driving migration patterns, escalating war and militarization, and deteriorating material conditions of many people's lives, we cannot hope to achieve a rights-based, evidence-based, gender-just approach to surrogacy, nor can we hope to address gender-based violence that way. In fact, we only leave more communities vulnerable to violence and exploitation, since harsh, punitive policies only drive the practice underground, as we've heard, rather than end its prevalence, leaving those engaged in surrogacy arrangements, particularly the women that agree to be surrogates, who typically come from socially and economically marginalized communities, most vulnerable to discrimination, violence, exploitation, and harm. This is why we need to build a broad and inclusive coalition of us to resist and push back against these attacks, because this has widespread implications for those working on healthcare, trans rights, intersex rights, disability justice, immigration justice, reproductive justice, children's rights, as you very rightly pointed out, Esther, sex workers' rights, etc. We must build collective analytical clarity as well as narrative tools which can effectively counter bad faith arguments. We should be the ones driving the conversation about exploitation. We should be the ones driving the conversation about what safety really means. And we should be the ones driving the conversation about how we address and prevent violence. Throughout our recent work on this issue, we have seen and heard nothing but hunger for collaboration and a total commitment to working together from diverse movement actors across the world. So we have a real momentum. We've seen real momentum, a thirst for collaboration, a real desire to work together. And we need to build on that momentum. And we need to tap into that thirst. And we need to also be supported to do so. And this goes to, all the kinds of different actors that hold decision-making power in terms of the supportive infrastructure that supports organizing, advocacy, movement work. We need to be supported to work outside of our silos. We need to be supported to work together, to reach across, all kinds of false borders, binaries, regional borders, national borders, etc. And we really need to be supported to work across these kind of false issue-based silos, which we know are not an effective way to meet this current moment and to meet this kind of highly coordinated opposition that many of us are facing wherever we may sit. So I'll end with that for now. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them as well. Thanks so much, Esther.
Thank you so much, Suba, and thank you very much for all of you. I know that unfortunately Sarojini had to leave, but she left us with some responses to the questions. So those who are on the webinar, you can go to the Q&A, and there are 3 categories about questions. One is that is still open, so we just got some recent questions. There are some under the answered ones that the panelists already responded to, and there are the dismissed. Nothing is dismissed. One of them is about the webinar. Sorry that I didn't say it earlier. You could have recorded by yourself. We are recording the webinar, and we are making it available both on the SRHM blog space. It will be on social media as well, and the partner institutions' websites as well. So I would like to go around the room, and maybe I will start with Chandi and Narima. There are some very concrete questions that we provided some answers to. There was one comment about the Swedish model, what the Swedish model means. There is Maya, who was asking about, from the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, about how women who are experiencing exploitation often don't go to NGOs for support, and why not, and what the experience around that. There is a question, I think that Narima, you could pick up around how shutting down surrogacy through regulations in India through turn to Kenya, and what the elements around this. But we have really around 15 minutes. So among the 4 of you, if you could address some of the questions that are raised, but also if you could say a couple of words that where do you see that with our very evidence and rights-based approach, cross-movement collaboration that is addressing violence against women, exploitation, trafficking, but also considering the documentation of the harmful impact of criminalization and those experiences that are documenting that how legal approach actually can navigate throughout rights-based and evidence-based surrogacy. Where should we go from here? What are the next steps that we want to address? I hope it's okay, Chandi, that I'm moving first to you, then Narima, then Veronica, and then Suba. Around 3 minutes each, please. Chandi, over to you. You are muted. You are muted. And you wanted to share the photo. Did you share? I may have missed this.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, and we can hear you.
All right, can you see the screen that I showed the picture?
Yes.
So these are just some of the example of the picture. You see like a lot of women during the pregnancy, they were coached like that and then put in the detention center like this, in small room. Some, they will also have a chance on their leg and also hand. And then they deliver the baby. One of them delivered twin. Two of them delivered twins. So when they asked for being the surrogate mother, they were told that they will be pregnant with twins and deliver the two twins in the detention center like that. And there was a question asking of like, what happened to the intended parent? So this happened to the intended parent. So see, some Chinese guy were put in prison for 15 years because they were charged as involving with child trafficking. Even they try so much in order to have their own biological kids. So answering to one of the questions that asking about what happened to the intended parent, right? So this happened in Cambodia. Another question also asked about what are the response from the women who were exploited and whether we have talked with them. After the 30 women who were punished under anti-human trafficking law, and they were put in jail for 20 years, but then were released on bail upon the condition of raising children until they are 18 years old. They were also kind of like stopped from talking with a lot of people. I'm sorry, I say goodbye, Ambassador.
Yeah, feel free to finish off.
Yeah.
Everyone else has gone, so I'm going to disappear. I just didn't want you to know you like to sort of disappear and find out. So feel free to give me a shout. You have my number?
Yes, I have you rolling into. Thank you so much,
Give me a
Ambassador.
shout, I'll pop down to say goodbye.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Yes. So regarding what the surrogacy mother, we talk with them, especially during they were told that they should not talk with any law or something like that, or otherwise they will be punished further, right? So that is why it's very hard to reach out to them. So some surrogate mother, they told us that they did not even know what surrogacy means until they act as surrogate mother themselves. And then when we talk with them, very few actually describe what happened to them as trafficking, and they see it as the economic or employment issues. So they said they just want to have for the family. For example, most surrogate mother we spoke with did not perceive themselves as victim of trafficking. They described their situation as informal labor, contract gone wrong, and then not as sexual or gender-based violence. And they highlight as inter-surrogacy volunteer, but the absence of legal protection made them vulnerable to the broker or police or stigma. So they also like seek help as well, even during the COVID-19, because they could not raise the kids by themselves, right? But during that time, they migrate from one place to another place, and it was very hard for us to see them, and they have to leave their own province because they were facing with discrimination from their neighbor. Some women who work as the garment factory worker, and then they become the surrogate mother, and then they have to raise the kid by themselves. And then those people are the neighboring discriminate against them, so they leave. So a lot of time we could not really contact them. The other thing that is very hard for them too is the legal services for them. So with the USAID fund cut and also SIDA living from Cambodia, also making us very hard to approach those surrogate mother who were punished already and have continue providing legal services for them. So these are just some of the example of how we deal with the women who were exploited, but they did not even know that they were exploited. I hope I answer some of the questions.
Yes, Jandy, and maybe I missed because I was for a moment I was blank, but the question was also, and you responded in the chat, that why they are not turning to the NGOs who are the anti-trafficking and violence against women NGOs, why the women are not turning to them. Can you just briefly say what you provided the answer in the chat?
Because they were scared when they were punished, they were told that if they intended to contact to any like legal services or any like the intended parent, the biological parents, they would be punished even more. Right. So giving this kind of like threatening, I don't know who threatened them because they did not even tell as well, make them hard to approach the NGO working on human and women rights. Another difficulty is that when talking about surrogacy, there are not many NGO in Cambodia who touch base on this kind of issue. And a lot of NGO here, they also still believe that surrogacy is also the act of human trafficking. Right, as one of the question, making one of the comment that the UN special rapporteur just issued the surrogacy as a global modern form of slavery. So this is just the assumption of a lot of local NGO here in Cambodia as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate. Narima, towards to you.
Yes, my question is on whether or not the surrogacy body in India has pushed surrogacy towards Kenya. So there are no statistics around this because surrogacy in Kenya isn't being tracked because it's unregulated. So there aren't credible statistics around surrogacy in the country, but there has been an uptick of a number of things that are indicators that the industry is growing. So one, there's been an increase in the number of agencies offering surrogacy services, as well as clinics offering these services, and not just offering them, but marketing them outside of the country. So marketing them to different nationals outside of the country, trying to prime Kenya as a destination for you to get these services. A number of these agencies are also relying on the lack of regulation and the lacuna around regulation to build the market around this prior to regulation coming on board. And some of them have even gone as far as relying on bills to frame something. So for instance, we have some agencies saying the reproductive healthcare bill says surrogacy must be offered altruistically. And so we can only be able to offer reasonable costs to a surrogate woman. However, it's a bill, it's not a law. So that it's not regulated. So it's sort of thing that you can rely on. So also utilizing bills to exploit women, so to speak, because by insisting that it must be offered altruistically and only reasonable costs can be covered, when that is not the legal position, it is exploiting that aspect to then misrepresent the true legal position. There's also been an uptick of law firms offering legal information around surrogacy. You can just Google it and you'll see like a number of law firms providing legal information around surrogacy because they also do stand to benefit from people coming to them, particularly because there is a lengthy adoption process that has to be navigated because, again, the lack of regulation means that one cannot automatically be registered as a parent. The commissioning parent will not be automatically registered as a parent. So there's still that lengthy adoption process to be negotiated. So that we have seen an uptick on these things that are indicators that there is an increase in the industry, but we cannot say directly that there's a correlation between this and the ban in India. But I will note that there definitely is significant effort being made to market Kenya as a place that is attractive for surrogacy because of the lack of regulation, so to speak, or the gray areas that can be exploited at this stage. What we would say, like overall, is that a lot of these things fail to then take into account, obviously, the surrogate woman in her position in this context, the surrogate woman in her ability to negotiate, and the surrogate woman and her protections. A lot of this fails to take that into account, and many of the frameworks are really around the best interest of the child and the interest of the commissioning parent. So the surrogate women just being either considered as a womb, but not an autonomous being, willing to negotiate the use of her womb.
Thank you so much, Narima. I'm following that that many of you are prepared to answer some of the questions. So I'm turning to you, Suba, to respond to some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll try to respond to a couple of the questions. One, I think, was about the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women's report on surrogacy. Yes, which we're aware of the report as well. Many of us have read it and are kind of fully aware of the series of interventions that I think she's planned around it as well. And I think what we have learned, in terms of how she uses evidence, which is not unique to this report. We've seen it in previous reports by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women as well. I think, in fact, SRHM and others did a really excellent intervention. I think both there's a written publication as well as a recorded conversation. Am I right, Esther, about the misuse of evidence by the Special Rapporteur in her previous report on prostitution, as she called it, which she also, kind of inherently claimed is inherently violence against women. And we saw the same pattern of misuse of evidence, misrepresentation of submissions, using submissions out of the context in which they were made. For example, using submissions made by organizations that are very clearly anti-criminalization, but taking things that they said about violence out of the context of their entire body of work, out of the context of the entire body of the kind of advocacy they use, and misusing it in a misleading, bad faith way. Also paying attention to certain submissions over others, the ones that suit her narrative, etc. So unfortunately, I think it's not particularly unique. What we've seen with the Special Rapporteur is that this is the way that she produces reports, and so I think it's to be expected. It's nothing remarkable given the history of the kind of reports that she's produced, unfortunately. But there have been many good feminist interventions which provide very clear, concrete, evidence-based kind of counterpoint to the sort of the things that she's producing. So I think this is what we can do. We have to create spaces like this one to have the conversations that we know we should be having, that we want feminists to be having, right? These are really complex issues that we are grappling with. We have had really wonderful, nuanced, complex kind of interventions today from all the speakers on this panel. So this is, our position is this is what we need to be doing, is creating the counter narrative space and the counter sort of narrative ourselves. I just want to respond also quickly to one of our colleagues' questions in the Q&A about how to counter arguments that are, with concern for the global South, global North divide, inequity, how to kind of deal with these arguments about exploitation of people in the global South by global North parties, etc. I think the thing that we have to consistently hold is that is true for pretty much any form of labor today. We cannot exceptionalize things like sex work or surrogacy to act as though other forms of this global market, so-called free trade market is not exploitative to many people in the global majority countries, as well as to people that are from marginalized groups in so-called powerful global North countries, right? So I think we then really need to have a serious conversation about economic inequality, the way in which capitalism has worked, the way in which capitalism has left so many communities on this planet, not just in global majority countries, but in so-called powerful countries, to living beneath the poverty line, not able to make a living wage, struggling with exploitation of their labor and also the extraction of their resources, right? The hostile takeover of their resources by powerful states and also non-state entities like private corporations. So I think, it's again, I think our job would be to point out the bad faith way in which surrogacy will get brought up in that context without an acknowledgement that is unfortunately the global capitalist market within which we live, and that's what we should be combating. Surrogacy is not a unique problem. It's a labor problem that can be applied to pretty much any avenue of labor.
Thank you so much, Suba. I'm turning to you, Veronica, for some reflections that across the questions. And in terms of looking into the future, where do we want to go from here? Towards to you, Veronica.
Thank you. Well, the Mexican experience shows is that banning, ignoring, or poorly regulating surrogacy does not solve the problem inherent to this practice. On the contrary, it worsens them by pushing it into informality and clandestinity, and also that this reality increases the vulnerability of women to that state leaves children without full guarantees of identity and legal parentage, and also creates legal uncertainty for the families involved. Therefore, what is urgently needed is a clear, comprehensive legal framework grounded in human rights. Regulating surrogacy means establishing conditions that protects the autonomy and the dignity of gestating individuals, ensuring their consent is free and fully informed. It also involves guaranteeing the necessary medical, psychosocial, and legal support to prevent any form of exploitation or abuse. And furthermore, it should include mechanisms for state oversight, transparency, and accountability of agencies and intermediaries, as well as safeguards to preserve the best interests of the children born to these arrangements, ensuring the right to know their origins and to be legally recognized. This is not about a regulation that eliminates all risks, because risks are inherent to any complex practice, but about regulating that manages, minimizes, and controls them, protecting those involved and promoting fair and safe conditions. The absence of a regulatory framework not only perpetuates inequality and lack of protection, but also limits the possibility of informed and responsible dialogue about this prevalent reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you so much for all the panelists for this extremely rich conversation. And we hope that we gave various perspectives about how can we work with the rights and evidence-based approach, and how to demonstrate that surrogacy is not a question of morality, but it's a rights, justice, and autonomy issue that includes protection against violence, protection against exploitation, protection against and action against trafficking. But it also requires the recognition of sexual and reproductive justice, the right to non-discrimination, bodily autonomy, economic justice, labor rights, and democracy itself. So our webinar and this conversation and bringing examples, really applied examples, evidence and rights-based examples from India, Cambodia, Mexico, Kenya, and across global feminists and cross-sectional movements. We really need cross-movement solidarity, a multidisciplinary approach and conversation, instead of just bringing evidence and manipulating evidence and rights-based approach that is one-sided, and really working together on advocating for upholding constitutional rights, creating laws and policies that protect all parties in relation to surrogacy and in our broader sexual and reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, democratic movement. And thank you again to our partners for the Center for Reproductive Rights, the Just Future Collaborative, ISLA, the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice, but also for SAMA, and also for our other partners, HIRE and others, for putting together this extremely rich conversation that is not the end. We are hoping that this conversation continues in different contexts, and we are hoping to documenting those in an evidence-based context. Sexual and reproductive health matters. Both the journal and the blog space provides the documentation of evidence, and really we are also looking forward to work with our partners to bring this evidence and rights-based voices forward. Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you for those who were attending this webinar. Please look for the webinar recording and on our website and our partners' website. And looking forward to see you in many different contexts, also in November in Bogota at the International Conference on Family Planning, when we plan to bring this conversation forward as well including in many other settings. Thank you so much and have a nice continuation of the day. Good night for those who are going to sleep, and bye-bye. Thank you for attending and participating in the panel. Thank you for all the panelists. Bye-bye.